Hello, everyone. Welcome to this conversation on American slavery. This conversation is going to focus on three aspects of American slavery. We're going to first look at the sort of defining features of American slavery. Then we're going to look at the ideology of American slavery or the defense that was put forward for slave ownership. And then thirdly, we're going to look at the Christian response to American slavery. So I want to begin with a question. What defines American slavery? What are those characteristics that define the institution of American slavery? I want you to think about that for a second. I want you to think about something like slavery and that occurring in America. What do you think defines American slavery? Kenneth Stamp, who wrote the book The Peculiar Institution, said slavery was above all a labor system. Wherever in the South the master lived, however many slaves he owned, it was his bondman's productive capacity that he generally valued most. And to the problem of organizing and exploiting their labor with maximum efficiency, he devoted much of his attention. The first feature of American slavery is that it was a system of economic exploitation. American slavery was a deliberate economic choice by one group of people to exploit the labor of another group of people so that they could do the least amount of work and make the most amount of money. So we have to understand that the foundational concept here in looking at these features of American slavery is the idea of it being a system of economic exploitation. It was a choice by a group of people to exploit another group of people's labor so that the first group didn't have to do the work and so that they could still, though, make the most amount of money. It was a system of economic exploitation. So within this system of economic exploitation, uh, we have to understand that slaves, millions of people, worked for free. But they were not paid for their labor. What kind of work did they do? Well, on this map, you can see that in the kind of orangish areas in the area of Tennessee and Virginia, there was tobacco production. And then along the East Coast in North Carolina, South Carolina, and Georgia, there was rice production. And then down at the bottom here in the yellow, you see sugarcane production in Louisiana and Texas. And then you see this gigantic area of green in which you have cotton production. The vast majority of slaves worked in these fields, the tobacco, rice, sugarcane, and cotton fields. Some were skilled workers, some were domestic servants, but the vast majority worked in these cash crop fields, producing an enormous amount of crops and also an enormous amount of wealth for slave owners. Now here's a picture from about 1850 of what's called the American South, and you can see the slaves picking cotton. And I think I chose this picture because you see the white overseer on the horse overseeing the slaves. And one of the things I like to point out is that there's a great diversity in the type of slave ownership and the type of plantation. There were these massive plantations with hundreds of slaves. The Frederick Douglass book talks about one in which Frederick Douglass lived on. But most slaves were owned by a person that only owned maybe one or two slaves, certainly less than 10. So you have these very small arrangements of slave ownership. You have very large arrangement of slave ownership. And then you have a whole bunch of people that are going to benefit from this system or be part of the system that don't own slaves. It's very likely that this overseer on the horse was a white man that was part of the system, but probably did not own these slaves. And so there's a whole bunch of complex associations of people involved and benefiting in the institution of slavery. So the second feature of American slavery is that of physical deprivation. Um, from the first feature, this idea of economic exploitation, comes the idea that slave owners viewed their slaves as an economic commodity and treated them as such. One of the really difficult things to have to come to terms with regarding slavery is that people were treated as economic commodities. Think about the dehumanization that comes along with that. And so what I mean to say by that is I want you to think about viewing people and taking care of people as an economic decision, not as a human decision, but as an economic decision. And so the reality is the life of a slave was often and most often the life of physical deprivation. Slaves were given enough food so that they could do the work. It was an economic decision of how much to feed slaves, the type of food that they were fed, the cornmeal mush that slaves were fed. We're not worried about taste or variety or anything like that. It's just enough food for them to be able to do the work. The clothing that slaves were given, harsh, coarse, linen cloths, clothing, maybe a couple shirts, a pair of trousers, a pair of socks, one pair of shoes for the year. Often, maybe parts of the year where they didn't have enough clothing or they didn't have shoes. The shelter, a 1 or 2 room shack with a dirt floor, with no beds. You'd be given a blanket. You just go to sleep on a damp dirt floor with a whole bunch of other people that were overcrowded into these places, into these slave quarters. And so we have to understand that uh, this is a system of physical deprivation, of giving people, of giving human beings only enough to survive so that they can do their work. The third feature of American slavery was a system of racial oppression. It's important for us to understand that there is a racial component to American slavery. In other parts of the world, it's not only black people that have been held in bondage, but in America, white Americans chose to go to Africa, get black people, and bring them here for the purpose of exploiting them for their labor. It was a very specific choice that we made. Whites did not enslave other whites in America, and whites did not enslave other races in America. Whites did not enslave Native Americans. This was a deliberate choice to go to Africa, get black people, and enslave black people here in America. And so there is a unique feature of American slavery, which is that it was a system of racial oppression. The fourth feature of American slavery was that it was a system of gradual adaptation. One of the things we have to understand about American slavery is the complexity of it. Slaves first were brought to America in 1619, and slavery ended in 1865. But to say that at any one point along that time period that slavery was a particular thing, or to try to say that from 1619 to 1865 slavery was a particular thing, would be an error. You would not be speaking the truth. Slavery was a system that gradually adapted and changed over time based on a lot of circumstances, the most important of which was the growth in the slave population. There was only about 1,500 slaves in America in 1650. By 1700, that number had grown to about 27,000, still a relatively small number of slaves. But by 1750, still in the colonial era, that number multiplied by 10 times from 1700 to 1750. We now have 250,000 slaves. That's a different thing. By 1800, we have a tripling of the population again, and that leaves us with now 900,000 slaves, almost a million slaves. And then by 1860, towards the tail end of slavery in America, we have almost 4 million slaves. And what we have to understand is an institution to control a few thousand slaves, an institution to control 4 million slaves is a very different thing. It's a very different thing. And so we have to understand that there's gradual adaptation over time, adjusting to the number of slaves that were here, and obviously adjusting to the amount of work that they could do and adjusting to the amount of money that they could create. And obviously from this, we see that there was a financial incentive for the slave population to grow. Slaves were making money. Again, going back to that first feature of economic exploitation, slaves were making money for other people, and that is a key element. So there's this gradual adaptation and change over time of the development of the slave institution of American slavery. So the fifth feature of American slavery is that of abject control. I use the word abject control because the word abject means maximum or the most of something. Slave owners felt it necessary to have abject control over the slave population, especially as it grew over time. There's tremendous fear among slave owners of what would happen if they lost control of their slaves. And, you know, the truth is that kind of makes sense, doesn't it? And so there are three aspects to this abject control that slave owners established. There's legal control, there's social control, and there's psychological control. The legal control was based on the fact that slaves, in a legal sense, were property. That was the status of a slave. And I want you to really stop and think about that for a second. I want you to think about the reality of owning another human being as property. And I want you to think about what a person can do with their property. What are your rights when it comes to how you deal with your own property? Well, if you think about it, you can buy and sell your property. Slaves could be bought and sold. That continued throughout the entire period of slavery. Humans were bought and sold by other humans. Slaves could be beaten. They could be punished. They could be killed. You can take care of your property, or you can not take care of your property. You can throw your property in the garbage. And so all of these things applied to the legal status of slaves. In fact, there were a whole list of codes written called slave codes because the regular legal system did not apply to the slaves. They weren't citizens, they weren't treated as other people were in society, and so there were codes established to deal with the control, the legal status of slaves. And under the slave codes, there were all kinds of different things that existed. It defined what slaves could and could not do. It defined their movement. Slave codes restricted where slaves could go. You couldn't just leave your plantation in any free time you had and go into town. There were restrictions on things like going to town or going to visit people or having people come and visit you. There were harsh forms of discipline that were legal. Your slaves could be beaten. Slaves were whipped, and that was a common thing. Slaves were tortured at times, and slaves were sometimes killed by their owners. Now that was not that was rare, uh, but not because slave owners thought they would get in trouble, because they wouldn't get in trouble for killing their slave. It was because slave owners would not want to lose the value of their property. But slaves would be killed at times, and there was no legal problem or legal consequence in most places for killing a slave. So the legal control slaves were property, and then there were these codes developed to control slave activity and their legal status. And then secondly, there's social control. This abject control had a social component to it. Slave families, marriages weren't recognized. They weren't legal in the slave community. And so marriage was a totally different thing. People did get married, but it was an informal thing. Slaves could be separated from their children. Parents could be separated from children. Husbands could be separated from wives. Siblings could be separated. That was, again, viewing people as an economic commodity changes the whole dynamic of what you view a family to be. And so how people were treated as far as family goes, that was a part of social control. Education, slaves were not permitted to learn to read and write. And so there was an educational aspect to the social control. And then slaves, we used religion. Slave owners used religion as a means of social control over slaves. And again, if you think of these elements, you have to be thinking about the dehumanization of the system, the dehumanizing effects. I'm not saying that people were dehumanized, but it is clearly an attempt to treat people as less than human. And then lastly, there's the psychological aspect to the feature of abject control. And there's two pieces of that. There is the attempt to convince slaves that they were less than other people, that they were less than human, and they belonged in slavery. So there's the attempt to psychologically convince slaves to accept slavery as their lot in life. And then secondly, there is the psychological component of fear, convincing slaves that if they step out of line, that there will be enormous consequences, and that they could end up in a situation far worse. They could be beaten, they could be killed, they could be moved to another place with a worse overseer and a worse master. And so that psychological control of trying to get slaves to accept their situation and then get them to be fearful of trying to object in any way to their situation. So slave owners established a system of abject control over their slaves. So the features of American slavery: a system of economic exploitation, choosing to exploit a group of people for their labor so that you can make the most amount of money. A system of physical deprivation, looking at people as an economic commodity and taking care of their basic needs based on that criteria of making the most money possible. It's a system of racial oppression. It's a system that chose to enslave a particular race of people, to enslave Black people here in America. It is a system of gradual adaptation. As the slave population grew, the system grew and changed over time. It's a complex, changing system. And then fifth, it's a system of abject control. It's a system of legal control, slaves as property being the foundation of that. It's a system of social control, and it's a system of psychological control. So I want to ask a question, and it's really something that we should take some time and think about. How do you defend something like this? How do you defend slavery? How do you defend the attempt to dehumanize people, the owning people as your property, the exploiting people for their labor, not paying them for their work, and taking the money for yourself? How do you defend something like slavery? Alexander Dumas, in one of his books in the series of books on the Three Musketeers, said, "There are no creatures that walk the earth, not even those animals we have labeled cowards, which will not show courage when required to defend themselves." And I want you to think about that for a second. And that's a very truthful statement. The truth is, the worst cowards we know, who wouldn't stand up for anything, for anyone else, will stand up for themselves, will demonstrate courage when it comes time to defend themselves. And that's the truth about serial killers. That's the truth about just about anybody that does anything wrong or ends up in prison. And that is the truth about the American slave owner. It is absolutely true that people will defend themselves and their own actions at all costs. And so in America, we developed an ideology of American slavery. We developed a defense of this institution and why it was necessary. And we're going to be talking over time about the changing ideology and the different aspects of it. But at the beginning, foundationally, there are three arguments that are made that form the original ideology of American slavery. The first argument is what we call the physical argument, and that is that the black race is better suited for the work and climate of the South. The black race is better suited for the work. In Africa, you have a similar climate to the American South, and you have the need to do very hard and physical labor in a harsh climate. And the physical argument says the black race was made to do that. They are adapted to it as a race. They are better suited for this work and this climate than the white race is. That's the physical argument. And secondly, they made a psychological argument. This says that the black race is naturally fitted to slavery. In other words, there's some racial characteristics within, innate to the black race, that kind of naturally fits them to be in bondage to another race of people, to another group of people. The white race, they would argue, or other races, maybe not naturally fitted to slavery. But the psychological argument is there's something about the way the black race of people think that they accept slavery. They're naturally fitted to slavery. They were made for slavery. The third argument is the behavioral argument. The idea that the black race is barbaric and in need of rigid discipline. There's something about the black race. Again, notice the racial characterizations here. There's something about the black race that makes them behave in a way that requires rigid discipline, the rigid discipline of the slave system, the slave codes, the abject control that we talked about earlier. So the ideology of American slavery at the beginning, it was a physical argument. Black race is better suited for the work and climate. It was a psychological argument. The black race is naturally fitted to slavery. And there's a behavioral argument. The black race is barbaric and in need of rigid discipline. Now, when you think about that, and you think about that ideology, that original defense or justification of slavery, and you think about the features of slavery as we've explained them, how would you expect Christians to respond to slavery? How would you expect Christians to respond to American slavery? Because we know that in America, there was millions of people owned as slaves, and there's also a lot of people who identified as Christians. How would you expect these people who identify as Christians to respond to slavery? Based on what you know of the Christian ideology, based on what you know of the Bible and the teachings of Christ, how would you expect Christians to respond to slavery? Frederick Douglass characterized the Christian response to slavery this way. He said, quote, "I love the pure, peaceable, and impartial Christianity of Christ. I therefore hate the corrupt, slave-holding, women-whipping, cradle-plundering, partial and hypocritical Christianity of this land. Indeed, I can see no reason but the most deceitful one for calling the religion of this land Christianity. I look upon it as the climax of all misnomers, the boldest of all frauds, and the grossest of all libels. So Frederick Douglass's very, very harsh statement on American Christianity's response to slavery is valid. Sadly, it's valid. And it's valid because most Christians, especially in the South, their main response to American slavery was participation, sanction, and support. American Christians participated in slavery. Most American Christians participated in slavery. Pastors, missionaries, and members of congregations owned slaves, and many others benefited economically from slavery, even if they did not own slaves. American Christians, massive numbers, not all American Christians, but a large number of American Christians participated in slavery. A large number of American Christians also sanctioned slavery. American Christians sanctioned slavery. Christians refused to condemn slavery. As you would expect, as Scripture, and applying Scripture to the things that we've talked about, American Christians refused to condemn slavery and instead sanctioned it as acceptable. They gave sanction to this institution, to those features that we talked about, to that ideology we talked about. American Christians sanctioned slavery. And then thirdly, American Christians supported slavery. Christians allowed their faith to be used to maintain control over the slave population. They allowed faith in Jesus Christ, the church, to be used to keep control over the slave population as part of that system of abject control, to get slaves to accept their situation in particular. American Christians allowed their faith to support slavery by maintaining control over the slave population. So the Christian response to American slavery, again, this is the complicit response. There is a courageous response, and we will continue to talk about that in our conversations. But the main Christian response is complicit. It's participation, sanction, and support. So in summary of our conversation on American slavery, we've talked about the features of American slavery. We've looked at economic exploitation and physical deprivation, racial oppression, gradual adaptation over time, and a system of abject control. We've looked at the ideology of American slavery, the physical, psychological, and behavioral arguments justifying American slavery. And we've looked at the Christian response to American slavery, participation, sanction, and support. Some questions to consider. What does centuries of slave ownership say about American values and ideals? What are the ramifications of centuries of making the physical, psychological, and behavioral arguments defending slavery? And what does the Christian response to American slavery say about American Christianity? Thanks for joining this conversation today. God bless you. Have a great day.